I sat in that coffee shop bathroom for 20 minutes, staring at the test, my mind completely blank. After years of desperate hoping, of timing and temperature taking and medical interventions, I was finally pregnant. But the baby growing inside me might not be my husband's. The irony was so cruel it almost made me laugh. Almost thought the timing made it impossible to know for certain. David and I had been intimate twice in the past month, obligatory scheduled encounters that felt more like medical procedures than expressions of love. But James and I had been together every Tuesday for 6 weeks. And once on a Thursday when he'd called to say he was thinking about me and couldn't wait until our next meeting, I drove home in a daze. The positive test hidden in my purse like a bomb waiting to explode. David was in his home office, working on blueprints for a new project, classical music playing softly in the background. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, focused, passionate, completely absorbed in creating something beautiful. I almost told him then, almost walked over to his desk, pulled out the test, and let whatever happened happen. But then, I imagined his face when I explained that I wasn't sure the baby was his. I imagined the questions, the accusations, the way our marriage would crumble under the weight of my betrayal. I imagined him looking at our child for the rest of his life and wondering if he was raising another man's baby. So I made a choice that would haunt me for the next 17 years. I walked over to David, wrapped my arms around his shoulders, and whispered in his ear that I had wonderful news. I told him we were going to have a baby. I watched his face transform with joy, watched him sweep me into his arms and spin me around the room, watched him cry tears of happiness for the first time since I'd known him, and I said nothing about James. The next Tuesday, I ended the affair. I told James I was pregnant, that I was going to try to make my marriage work, that we couldn't see each other anymore. He was devastated but understood. He kissed me goodbye in the parking lot of the community center, and I drove away knowing I was closing the door on the most authentic relationship I'd ever had. I never went back to the grief support group. I told David I felt ready to move forward, to focus on our growing family instead of our past disappointments. He was so happy about the pregnancy that he didn't question my sudden change in attitude. We started preparing for the baby with an enthusiasm that felt almost manic, as if we could will ourselves back to happiness through sheer force of anticipation. But late at night, when David was asleep beside me and I could feel the baby moving inside me, I would wonder whose child I was carrying. I would imagine James's hands on my belly, imagine him feeling his son or daughter kick. Imagine the life we might have had if I'd been brave enough to tell the truth. Emma was born on a bright June morning after 18 hours of labor. The moment they placed her in my arms, I knew with absolute certainty that she was James's daughter. She had his eyes, that distinctive hazel color, with flecks of gold that I'd memorized during our stolen afternoons. She had his nose, his mouth, even the way his hair curled at the temples. David was so overcome with joy that he didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't want to notice. I named her Emma, after James's lost daughter, telling David it was a family name on my mother's side. He loved it immediately, said it was perfect for our perfect little girl. As he held her for the first time, tears streaming down his face, I felt my heart breaking into pieces that I knew would never fit back together properly. The first year was a constant state of hypervigilance. Every time someone commented on Emma's eyes, every time they noted she looked nothing like David, every time a well-meaning relative remarked on genetics, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope over an abyss. David was such a devoted father that it made my secret even more unbearable. He would spend hours just staring at Emma, marveling at her tiny fingers and toes, completely besotted with this child who wasn't biologically his. I tried to convince myself that biology didn't matter, that love was thicker than blood, that David was Emma's real father in every way that counted. But the guilt was eating me alive. I started having panic attacks, sudden moments when I couldn't breathe, when the weight of my deception felt like it was crushing my chest. I told David it was postpartum anxiety, and he was so supportive, so understanding, that it only made me feel worse. When Emma was 14 months old, I saw James at a grocery store across town. He was alone, looking tired and older than I remembered. Our eyes met across the produce section, and for a moment, time stopped. He started walking toward me, and I panicked. I grabbed Emma from her stroller and practically ran to the checkout line, leaving half my groceries behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way James had looked at Emma, the recognition in his eyes, the way he'd started to smile before I'd fled. I wondered if he'd seen what I saw every time I looked at our daughter, his own features reflected in her face, his own genes expressed in her laughter and her stubborn streak. I made a decision that night that would define the next 15 years of my life. I would never tell anyone the truth about Emma's paternity. I would bury the secret so deep that sometimes I could almost convince myself it wasn't real. I would be the best mother I could be, the best wife I could manage, and I would carry this burden alone to protect the family I'd built on a foundation of lies. But secrets have a way of growing in the dark, becoming more powerful with each passing year. What started as a moment of weakness, a desperate attempt to hold on to happiness, became the defining feature of my existence. Every birthday, every Father's Day, every time Emma achieved something wonderful, and David beamed with pride, I felt the weight of my deception a little more heavily. As Emma grew older, the resemblance to James became more pronounced. She had his artistic talents, his way of seeing the world from unique angles, his gentle nature combined with surprising strength. David attributed these qualities to my side of the family, or to his own mother, whom he barely remembered. He loved Emma with such fierce devotion that I sometimes wondered if he suspected the truth and simply chose not to acknowledge it. When Emma was 5, we decided to try for another baby. The fertility struggles had apparently been resolved by Emma's birth, and I got pregnant quickly. This time, I knew, without question, that the baby was David's. I could feel the difference in my body, in the way the pregnancy progressed, in the way this child moved inside me. When Michael was born, he was unmistakably David's son, the same dark hair, the same serious expression, the same analytical mind that would become apparent as he grew. Having a second child should have eased my guilt, should have made me feel like I'd given David the family he deserved. Instead, it highlighted the difference between the two children, made Emma's parentage seem even more obvious to me. I found myself treating them differently, being more protective of Emma while encouraging Michael's independence. David noticed and gently suggested I might be overcompensating for some imagined slight, but he didn't push the issue. The years passed in a blur of school events, family vacations, and the ordinary rhythms of raising children. David was an excellent father to both kids, never showing favoritism, always present and engaged. Emma adored him, and he her. Their relationship was so natural and loving that I sometimes managed to forget the truth myself. In those moments, we felt like a normal family, unmarked by deception. But then Emma would tilt her head in a way that was pure James, or she'd make a particular expression that would transport me back to that community center room, and the guilt would crash over me like a wave. I started avoiding certain places in town, terrified of running into James again. I changed grocery stores, found new routes to work, lived in constant fear that our paths would cross and somehow the truth would come spilling out. When Emma was 12, she started asking questions about genetics in school. She wanted to know why she looked so different from David and Michael, why her eyes were hazel when theirs were brown, why she was left-handed when no one else in our immediate family was. I deflected with vague explanations about recessive genes and distant relatives, but I could see the wheels turning in her intelligent mind. That Christmas, David's sister gave us a family DNA testing kit as a gift. One of those services that promise to reveal your ancestry and connect you with relatives. Emma was fascinated and begged us to do it as a family project. I made excuse after excuse, concerns about privacy, questions about accuracy, general skepticism about the whole concept. David thought I was being paranoid, but he didn't insist when I quietly asked him to put the kit away. The close calls were becoming more frequent, and I was running out of ways to deflect Emma's growing curiosity about her heritage. I started having nightmares about the truth being revealed, about watching David's face crumble when he realized what I'd done, about losing everything I'd worked so hard to protect. My name is Sarah, and I am 43 years old. I have carried a secret for 17 years that has eaten away at my soul like acid on metal, corroding everything I once believed about myself and my family. Today, as I sit in this empty house, with divorce papers on the kitchen table and my youngest daughter's college acceptance letter in my trembling hands, I finally understand that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. The weight of what I've done has crushed not just me, but everyone I love. It started on a rainy Tuesday in October, 17 years ago. I was 26, married to David for 3 years, and we had been trying to have a baby for what felt like an eternity. The fertility treatments, the disappointments, The way David's eyes would dim every time I shook my head after another negative test. It was destroying us slowly, methodically. I remember standing in our small bathroom, staring at yet another single line on a pregnancy test, feeling like a failure as a woman, as a wife, as a human being. David was working late again that night. His architecture firm was demanding, and I knew he was throwing himself into work to avoid facing our reality. I was alone in our apartment, surrounded by baby magazines I couldn't bring myself to throw away and a nursery we'd started painting in optimistic yellow. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rain against our windows and my own ragged breathing. That's when I made the phone call that would change everything. My sister Alina had been trying to convince me to join her at a grief support group for women dealing with infertility. She'd lost 2 babies to miscarriage and swore the group had saved her sanity. I'd resisted for months, but that night, drowning in my own despair, I finally agreed to go. The community center smelled like stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, boxes of tissues strategically placed, and 7 other women who looked as broken as I felt. The facilitator, a kind woman named Margaret, encouraged us to share our stories, our pain, our hopes. I listened to tales of loss that made my heart ache, of dreams deferred and relationships strained by the weight of wanting something so desperately that it consumed everything else. Then I met him. James wasn't part of the group. He was Margaret's son, 28, recently divorced, and helping his mother with setup each week. He had kind eyes and a gentle way of moving through the room, refilling water glasses and straightening chairs with quiet efficiency. When he smiled at me after that first meeting, something inside me responded in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love, not then, it was recognition. The way one drowning person might reach for another. I started looking forward to Tuesdays in a way that terrified me. James would arrive early to help set up, and we'd exchange brief conversations about books, about the weather, about everything except the obvious tension building between us. He never asked about my husband, and I never mentioned David's name. It was as if we existed in this separate reality, this pocket of time where I could be someone other than the woman who couldn't give her husband a child. The group sessions became background noise. I'd participate, share when expected, offer comfort to other women, but my real focus was on the man quietly arranging chairs around the perimeter of the room. James had lost his own child, a daughter who died at 6 months from SIDS, and his marriage hadn't survived the grief. There was a hollowness in his eyes that matched my own, a recognition of loss that didn't need words. It was the 8th week when everything changed. I'd arrived early, hoping to catch a few minutes with James before the others arrived. The parking lot was empty except for Margaret's car, and I found him alone in the meeting room, staring out the window at the autumn leaves swirling in the wind. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, the changing seasons, a book he was reading, the way grief makes time feel both endless and too short. Then Margaret called to say she was running late, and suddenly we were alone in a way we'd never been before. The silence stretched between us, loaded with months of unspoken longing and shared understanding. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. When he whispered my name like a prayer, I stepped closer. When he kissed me in that sterile community center room, I kissed him back with 17 years of pent-up hunger and desperation. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. The other women started arriving, and we sprang apart like guilty teenagers. The meeting proceeded normally, but I couldn't concentrate on anything except the way James's eyes kept finding mine across the room. The way my lips still tingled from his kiss. The way my wedding ring suddenly felt like a weight I couldn't bear. David was already asleep when I got home that night. I stood in our bedroom doorway, watching him sleep, and felt like I was looking at a stranger. The man I'd married seemed so far away from the woman I was becoming, so disconnected from the hunger that James had awakened in me. I slipped into bed beside him, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay awake planning next Tuesday, counting the days until I could see James again. The affair began in earnest 3 weeks later. Margaret had canceled a session due to illness, but James called to let me know he'd be at the center anyway, cleaning up from a day program. I told David I was meeting Elena for dinner, and drove through the October darkness with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. We made love on the floor of that meeting room, surrounded by the folding chairs where women shared their deepest pain each week. It was desperate and hungry, and nothing like the careful, clinical intimacy David and I had cultivated around our fertility schedule. With James, I felt alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He touched me like I was precious, like I was whole, like I was enough, exactly as I was. Afterward, we lay on his jacket, talking in whispers about our lives, our losses, our dreams. He told me about his daughter Emma, about the way she'd smile in her sleep and how he still woke up some mornings expecting to hear her crying. I told him about the emptiness that lived in my chest, about the way I felt like I was failing at the most basic human function, about the growing distance between David and me. We never talked about the future. We never made plans beyond the next Tuesday. It was as if we both understood that what we were doing existed outside of time, outside of consequence, outside of the real world, where I had a husband and he had a mother who trusted me to heal, not to destroy. The physical relationship was intoxicating, but it was the emotional connection that truly undid me. James listened to me in a way David never had, even in our best times. He saw my pain and didn't try to fix it, didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He simply held space for my grief and let me know I wasn't alone in it. For 6 weeks, I lived 2 lives. Tuesday afternoons were mine and James's, stolen hours in empty classrooms and his small apartment across town. The rest of the week belonged to David, to maintaining the facade of our marriage, to pretending I was still the woman he'd married. The compartmentalization was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed this connection to heal, that it wasn't really hurting anyone. Then I missed my period. At first, I assumed it was stress, the affair, the lying, the constant state of anxiety I'd been living in. But as the days passed and other symptoms appeared, a terrifying possibility began to take shape. I bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy across town, somewhere David would never go, and took it in the bathroom of a coffee shop where no one knew my name. 2 lines, clear, undeniable, world-changing, 2 lines, asterisk. Emma's teenage years brought new challenges. She was brilliant, creative, and increasingly independent. She also began to look more like James with each passing year, developing his artistic eye and his way of questioning everything around her. At 15, she announced she wanted to be a photographer, and when David bought her a professional camera for her birthday, I watched her handle it with an intuitive understanding that reminded me so strongly of James that I had to excuse myself from the room. The resemblance wasn't just physical anymore. Emma had James's empathy, his ability to see pain in others and respond with kindness. She volunteered at a local animal shelter, organized fundraisers for homeless families, and seemed to have a natural understanding of human suffering that both impressed and worried me. David was so proud of her compassion, never knowing that these qualities came from a man whose kindness had briefly saved me from my own despair. Michael, meanwhile, was becoming more like David every day. He was logical, methodical, and fascinated by how things worked. He built elaborate structures with blocks and later with actual tools, showing an engineering mind that delighted his father. Watching them work together on projects in the garage, I felt a complex mixture of joy and guilt. David had one biological child and one he believed was his, and he loved them both completely. When Emma was 16, she started dating a boy named Alex whose parents were going through a messy divorce. She would come home from his house with tears in her eyes, frustrated by the pain she witnessed but unable to help. One night, she asked me about secrets, whether keeping them was ever the right thing to do, whether protecting people from painful truths was worth the cost of living with lies. I nearly broke down and told her everything right then, looking at her across our kitchen table, seeing so much of James in her face. I wanted to finally unburden myself of the secret that had shaped our entire family. But then David came home from work, kissed both of us hello, and started talking about college applications and Emma's bright future. And I realized I couldn't destroy his happiness for my own peace of mind. The college application process was particularly difficult. Emma wanted to apply to art schools, following her passion for photography and visual storytelling. David was supportive but worried about her practical prospects, encouraging her to consider more traditional academic paths as well. I found myself in the middle, trying to advocate for Emma's dreams while managing David's concerns, all while knowing that her artistic talents came from a father she'd never met. One evening, while helping Emma edit her portfolio, I made a mistake that nearly exposed everything. She was showing me a series of photographs she'd taken of elderly couples, capturing the intimacy and history visible in their faces and gestures. The work was extraordinary, showing a maturity and insight that amazed me. Without thinking, I said, "You get this from your father." Emma looked at me strangely and said, "Dad's never shown any interest in photography." I quickly covered, claiming I meant she'd inherited David's attention to detail, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. That night, I lay awake wondering how much longer I could maintain this charade. Emma was getting older, more perceptive, more likely to start putting pieces together. The DNA testing kits were becoming more popular, genetic genealogy was in the news, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth found a way to surface. Emma's senior year of high school brought the college acceptance letters, and with them, a new crisis. She'd been accepted to several prestigious art programs, including one in the city where James lived. When she announced her intention to attend the urban campus, I felt like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion. The chances of her encountering James were small, but not impossible. What if she took a photography class at the community college, where his mother still worked? What if she volunteered at the same grief support center where we'd met? What if she simply wandered into the wrong coffee shop at the wrong time? I tried to convince her to choose a different school, emphasizing the benefits of smaller programs and closer-to-home options, but Emma was determined, and David supported her choice completely. He was proud of her independence and excited about her artistic prospects. I watched them planning her future together, and I felt like I was sending my daughter into a minefield I'd created 17 years earlier. The summer before Emma left for college was torture. Every conversation about her plans, every discussion of her major, every mention of the city where she'd be living felt like a weight on my chest. I found myself making excuses to avoid these talks, claiming headaches or work stress whenever the subject came up. David started to worry about my mental health, suggesting I see a counselor to deal with what he assumed was empty nest syndrome. In August, we drove Emma to campus for orientation. As we walked through the city streets, I found myself scanning every face, terrified of seeing James around any corner. The community center where we'd met was only a few miles from Emma's dorm, and I knew he might still be involved there. I was so anxious that I could barely focus on the orientation activities, leaving David to handle most of the logistics while I struggled to appear normal. The night before we left Emma at school, she asked me to take a walk with her around the campus. It was a beautiful evening, and she wanted to show me some of the buildings where she'd be taking classes. As we walked, she talked about her excitement for the future, her plans for her photography, her hopes for the kinds of stories she wanted to tell with her art. I listened, trying to memorize everything about this moment, my daughter on the cusp of adulthood, full of dreams and possibilities. Then she stopped walking and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart started racing, and I felt like I might faint. "Do you think I'm adopted?" she asked. "I've always felt different from Dad and Michael, and I've done some research online about genetics. I know the odds of having hazel eyes when both parents have brown eyes, and I know about blood types and facial structure. I'm not stupid, Mom. I can see that I don't look like either of you." I stood there on that sidewalk, looking at my daughter's face in the lamplight, seeing James's eyes staring back at me with such trust and hope. She thought she was adopted. She thought we'd chosen her, saved her, given her a family out of love rather than circumstance. The truth was so much more complicated and painful than what she was imagining. I could have told her the truth then. I could have explained about the fertility struggles, about James, about the affair and the pregnancy and the 17 years of lies. But looking at her hopeful face, I made another choice that would define our relationship forever. I lied again. "Emma, sweetheart," I said, taking her hands in mine, "you're not adopted. You're my biological daughter, and Dad's too. Sometimes genetics are just unpredictable." I watched her face fall slightly, and I knew she didn't entirely believe me, but she wanted to believe me, wanted to trust that her parents were telling her the truth. So she accepted my explanation, even though it didn't satisfy her logical mind. Finished our walk in relative silence, and the next morning, David and I drove home to a house that felt eerily empty without Emma's presence. Michael was starting his junior year of high school, and the house echoed with the absence of his sisters, laughter and energy. David threw himself into work, and I found myself with too much time to think, too many quiet moments when the weight of my secrets pressed down on me like a physical force. Emma called regularly during her first semester, sharing stories about her classes, her roommate, her photography projects. She sounded happy and engaged, and I was relieved that she seemed to be thriving in her new environment. But I also listened carefully for any mention of names I recognized, any indication that she might have encountered James or anyone connected to him. In October, she called with excitement about a photography exhibition she was planning to attend. It was a showcase of work by local artists, including some who taught workshops at various community centers around the city. My blood ran cold. I tried to sound casual as I asked for more details, but Emma was too caught up in her enthusiasm to notice my anxiety. She talked about wanting to network with established photographers, about learning from people who'd been working in the field for years. I spent the next week in a state of constant panic. I couldn't call Emma and tell her not to go without raising suspicions, but I also couldn't bear the thought of her potentially meeting James at this exhibition. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, waiting for a call that would shatter our carefully constructed world. The call never came. Emma attended the exhibition, met several interesting photographers, and came home full of new ideas and inspiration. She never mentioned meeting anyone named James, never described anyone who sounded like him. I allowed myself to believe we dodged another bullet, that maybe the universe was protecting us from the collision I'd been dreading. But the close calls were taking their toll on me. I was losing weight, having trouble sleeping, and finding it difficult to concentrate at work. David noticed my deteriorating state and insisted I see a doctor. I went through the motions of medical tests and consultations, but I knew no physician could cure what was really wrong with me. The sickness was in my soul, and it was growing stronger with each passing year. Michael started asking questions about college applications, and I realized we'd soon be going through the same process with him that we'd just completed with Emma. He was interested in engineering programs, following in David's footsteps in a way that filled me with both pride and sadness. At least with Michael, I wouldn't have to worry about hidden connections or dangerous encounters. His path was clear, his parentage unquestioned, his future unburdened by the lies that had shaped his sister's life. Emma's sophomore year brought new challenges. She was taking more advanced photography classes and working on a documentary project about family secrets and hidden histories. When she described the concept to me over the phone, I felt like she was somehow looking directly into my soul, seeing the truth I'd worked so hard to hide. She talked about how every family has stories that get buried, truths that are too painful to acknowledge, and how photography could be a way of excavating those hidden narratives. I asked her to send me some of her work, and when the photographs arrived, I was stunned by their power and insight. Emma had captured images of elderly people holding old photographs, their faces showing the weight of memories and untold stories. There was something haunting about the work, something that suggested she understood more about secrets and lies than I'd ever imagined. One photograph in particular took my breath away. It showed an older woman clutching a baby picture, her expression a mixture of love and profound sadness. Emma had captured something in the woman's eyes that reminded me of my own reflection during those dark years when I'd wondered if I was carrying James's child. The technical skill was impressive, but it was the emotional depth that left me shaken. I called Emma to tell her how moved I was by her work, but she seemed distant during our conversation. She said she was thinking a lot about truth and lies, about the stories people tell themselves to survive, about the price of keeping secrets. I felt like she was speaking directly to me, like she somehow knew what I'd been hiding all these years. That night, I had a dream about James. We were back in the community center, but instead of the grief support group, Emma was there with her camera, taking pictures of us together. In the dream, she kept asking us to hold still, to look at each other, to show her what love looked like. I woke up in a cold sweat, David stirring beside me, and I knew I couldn't continue living this way. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I looked up James's name online, something I'd avoided doing for 17 years. I found him, Isali. He was working as a graphic designer now, had remarried, and had a son who looked to be about 10 years old. There was a photograph of him on his company's website, and seeing his face after all these years hit me like a physical blow. He looked older, happier, more settled than the broken man I'd known during those Tuesday afternoons. I stared at that photograph for a long time, studying his features and comparing them to Emma's face. The resemblance was undeniable, and I wondered how I'd managed to convince myself for so long that no one else would see it. I thought about his new family, his young son, the life he'd built after our affair ended. I wondered if he ever thought about me, about the baby I'd told him I was carrying, about the daughter he'd never known existed. For the first time in years, I seriously considered telling the truth, not just to Emma, but to everyone. I imagined sitting down with David and explaining everything, imagined contacting James and telling him about Emma, imagined finally lifting the weight of this secret from my shoulders. But then I thought about the devastation it would cause, the lives it would destroy, the family it would tear apart, and I realized I was trapped by my own lies, imprisoned by the very secret I'd created to protect everyone I loved. Spring brought Emma home for a brief visit, and I was shocked by how much she'd changed. She seemed older, more serious, and there was something in her eyes that reminded me of myself during those months when I'd been carrying the secret of her conception. She was polite but distant, spending most of her time in her room working on her photography or out with old friends from high school. One evening, she asked me to look at her latest project. It was a series of photographs titled The Things We Don't Say, and each image was accompanied by a brief written narrative about secrets and silence. One story was about a woman who'd had an affair and spent years wondering if her child belonged to her husband or her lover. Another was about a man who discovered his father wasn't his biological parent, but chose never to confront his mother about it. Each narrative was fictional, Emma assured me, but inspired by real emotions and situations she'd observed. I read through the stories with growing horror, recognizing my own situation reflected in multiple narratives. Emma's artistic eye had somehow captured the universal nature of family secrets, the way lies shape relationships, the cost of protecting people from painful truths. When I finished reading, I looked up to find her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What do you think?" she asked, and I realized she was asking about more than just her artistic work. She was asking about truth and lies, about the stories we tell ourselves and others, about the price of keeping secrets that eat away at our souls. I told her the work was powerful, that she had a gift for seeing into people's hearts and capturing their hidden pain, but I also sensed she was waiting for me to say something more, to acknowledge what we both knew but couldn't name. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated, circling around a truth that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. That night, I found David in his study, working on plans for a new building. I sat down across from him and really looked at him for the first time in months. He was 59 now, graying at the temples, wearing reading glasses that made him look distinguished and wise. He'd been such a good husband, such a devoted father, and I'd repaid his love with lies and betrayal. I almost told him everything then, almost confessed about James, about the affair, about Emma's true parentage. But as I opened my mouth to speak, he looked up from his blueprints and smiled at me with such warmth and trust that I lost my nerve. Instead, I told him I loved him, and he said he loved me too, and we went to bed like any other married couple, carrying our separate burdens of knowledge and ignorance. The next morning, Emma announced she was thinking about taking a summer internship in the city instead of coming home. She'd been offered a position with a photographer who specialized in documentary work, and she was excited about the opportunity to develop her skills further. David was supportive, proud of her ambition and talent. I felt like I was watching my daughter walk deliberately into danger, but I couldn't warn her without revealing why I was afraid. As Emma packed to return to school, I helped her carry boxes to her car. She hugged me goodbye, and for a moment, I felt like I was holding James in my arms, the same height, the same way of fitting against my shoulder, the same gentle strength in her embrace. When she pulled away, she looked at me with those hazel eyes and said, "Mom, I hope someday you'll trust me enough to tell me the truth." Emma returned to school the next day, leaving me to wrestle with the decision of whether to tell David. She'd handled the revelation with such grace and wisdom that I found myself wondering if I'd underestimated everyone's capacity to handle difficult truths. Maybe I'd been protecting people who were stronger than I'd given them credit for. The house felt different with Emma gone and her knowledge hanging in the air. I found myself looking at David with new eyes, wondering how he would react if he knew, wondering if our marriage could survive such a massive betrayal. He seemed so content, so settled in his understanding of our life together. Was it fair to shatter that peace for the sake of my own conscience? Michael noticed my distraction and asked if I was okay. Looking at him so clearly, David's son, so uncomplicated in his place in our family, I felt the full weight of the lies I'd told. Emma had been forced to navigate questions about her identity, doubts about her parentage, confusion about why she felt different from the rest of us. Michael had been spared all of that, but he'd also grown up with a mother who was only half present, distracted by secrets and guilt. In September, Emma called to tell me she'd decided to maintain a limited relationship with James. They met for coffee occasionally, and she'd spent time with his family, getting to know her half-brother. She spoke about James with warmth, but no illusions. She understood that he was her biological father. But David remained the man who'd raised her, loved her, and shaped her into the person she'd become. "He's a good man," she said about James, "and I can see why you cared about him, but he's not my dad. Dad is my dad, and nothing changes that." Her words both comforted and convicted me. She'd found a way to integrate this new knowledge into her life without letting it destroy what we'd built together. October brought David's 60th birthday, and we planned a family celebration. Emma came home for the weekend, and Michael invited his girlfriend to join us. As we sat around the dinner table, I watched David surrounded by the people he loved most. Completely unaware that one of his children wasn't biologically his, was telling stories about his own father, talking about the importance of family legacy and the traits that get passed down through generations. Emma caught my eye across the table, and I saw understanding there, but also a question. How long was I going to let this continue? How long was I going to let David live in ignorance of the truth about his family? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found Emma in the kitchen, making tea. We sat together in the darkness, talking quietly about the future, about truth and lies, about the price of keeping secrets. She told me about her photography project, how documenting other people's hidden stories had helped her understand our situation better. "I think Dad deserves to know," she said finally, "not because the truth will change anything about how we feel about each other, but because he deserves to make his own choices about how to handle it. You've been making decisions for him for 17 years, Mom. Maybe it's time to trust him to make his own." Her words hit me like a physical blow because I knew she was right. I'd been so focused on protecting David that I'd never considered whether he'd want to be protected. I'd robbed him of the chance to choose how to respond to this situation, assumed he couldn't handle the truth, treated him like a child who needed to be shielded from difficult realities. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm scared he'll leave me. I'm scared he'll hate me. I'm scared I'll lose everything." Emma reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, you've been living in fear for 17 years. You've already lost so much to this secret. Maybe it's time to find out what's on the other side of the truth." November passed in a blur of internal debate and sleepless nights. I drafted dozens of letters to David, trying to find the right words to explain 17 years of deception. I practiced conversations in my head, imagining every possible way he might react. I consulted with a therapist, trying to find the courage to face the consequences of my choices. Emma called regularly, checking on me, offering support without pushing me toward any particular decision. She was completing her final semester and working on a senior thesis project about family secrets and their impact on relationships. She'd found her voice as an artist, and I was proud of the woman she'd become despite the lies that had shaped her childhood. Michael was thriving in his first semester of college, calling home with stories about his engineering classes and new friends. He was so much like David, logical, straightforward, comfortable with facts and figures. I wondered how he would handle the revelation that his family was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. December brought the holidays and another family gathering. Emma came home for winter break, and we fell into familiar patterns of cooking together, shopping for gifts, and preparing for David's favorite time of year. But underneath the normalcy, I could feel the weight of unspoken truths, the tension of secrets that wanted to be told. On Christmas Eve, as we sat by the fireplace opening presents, David gave me a photo album he'd been working on for months. It was a collection of our family memories, pictures from Emma's childhood, Michael's growing up years, vacations and holidays, and ordinary moments that had shaped our life together. As I flipped through the pages, I saw the story of our family, told in images, and I realized how much love had gone into creating these memories, how much joy we'd shared despite the lies at the foundation. The last page of the album contained a recent family photo and a note from David: "To my beautiful wife, who gave me the family I always dreamed of. Thank you for Emma, for Michael, for the life we've built together. I love you more today than I did when we first married." I started crying as I read his words, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his love and the depth of my deception. Emma was watching me from across the room, and I saw in her eyes the same question that had been haunting me for months. When would I finally trust David with the truth? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I made my decision. I would tell David everything after the holidays, after we'd had our last Christmas as a family, innocent of the complications I'd created. I would find the courage to face whatever consequences came, to trust that our love was strong enough to survive the truth. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. On December 28th, David's phone rang while we were having breakfast. It was his doctor, asking him to come in to discuss some routine blood work that had shown unexpected results. David was calm, reassuring us that it was probably nothing serious, but I felt a familiar dread settling in my stomach. The next morning, David came home from his appointment with devastating news. The blood work had revealed genetic markers that suggested a serious hereditary condition, something that would require extensive family medical history and genetic testing for our children. The doctor wanted to test both Emma and Michael to determine if they'd inherited the condition, and to establish baseline monitoring if they had. I watched David's face as he explained the situation, saw his concern for our children's health, his determination to get them the medical care they might need, and I realized that the truth was about to come out, whether I was ready or not.